I'm Stuart Preston, and this is the Consciousness Podcast, where each week I have a conversation with an expert in human consciousness. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with Jonathon Simon, who is a postdoctoral associate in the NYU Department of Philosophy and a research fellow of the NYU Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness and the Global Institute for Advanced Study Project on Space, Time, and Consciousness. His primary research is in the metaphysics of mind. He also has research interests in perception, the metaphysics of science, moral psychology, value theory, and legal and political philosophy. We had a great discussion on property dualism, the immortality of the soul, and much more. So please enjoy this edition of the Consciousness Podcast with Jonathon Simon. Appreciate you joining today. So I'll just start with a typical question so we have a baseline to work from. How do you define consciousness?
Oh, great question. I mean, I think actually I'm not going to answer that question directly because I would actually say you can't define consciousness. Consciousness is a primitive. But what I would really say is I think of consciousness as the state of, the light being on, the state of there being something it's like to be you. But again, I would stress that really any attempt to define consciousness is going to end up going in circles. And really the project here is to kind of, point to it, indicate it in the right sort of way, direct attention properly. And so, you can talk about the feel of a headache or the experience of something that's shining brilliant red. But each of those terms, feel and experience, they can each be questioned. So I think the point is, as one of my professors, Ned Block, likes to say, it's like what Louis Armstrong said about jazz. If you have to ask, you ain't never going to get to know. And, that's not quite right because people can ask what jazz is. The point is, the only kind of answer you can really give is say, hey, it's that. It's music like this. So, I think consciousness is the state of the light being on.
Okay. It is that feeling, that sensation of knowing that the light is on. I
wouldn't say knowing. I think the light can be on even if you don't know it's on. I think to know about consciousness is knowing that the light is on. But in principle, it's just, there's either something it's like to be you or there isn't. And you might think there's nothing it's like. You might not know that there's something it's like. But as long as there's something it's like, then you're conscious.
Right.
Then you're conscious, yeah.
Then you're conscious.
Although it's tricky too, Daniel Stoljar, who's an important philosopher at the Australian National University, has a whole bit about how the phrase something it's like is problematic itself. And if you try to analyze that one way, it falls apart. And if you try and analyze it another way, it also falls apart. So again, even the phrase something it's like, you can't lean too much on, it's all about just sort of gesturing the right direction. And basically, I think when we talk about consciousness, we're talking about a conceptual primitive. If I asked you to define adding in terms of other operations, you could maybe reduce talk of adding to talk about a successor function or something like that. But ultimately, you've got to start somewhere. And I think that consciousness is really one of those primitives.
The primitive meaning it's the essential element, like the
like a basic element. It's a building block concept. It's one of the concepts that you have. Maybe you have to work at it. You have to kind of polish it off. But you've got to already be equipped with some grasp of something in the vicinity in order to learn about it. Okay.
Well, I don't know if that gives me much hope since I never really did understand jazz.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah. But, so I guess we could build on the concept then. And I saw in some of your writings that you describe yourself as a quote property dualist, and you can't look at consciousness without looking at dualism or physicalism. But I never came across property dualism or property dualist. So what does that mean?
So the basic distinction here is between property dualism and substance dualism. And so this is a basic metaphysical distinction where a substance is a thing, something that's concrete, an object that persists through time and has properties. And then properties are the things that, the ways that things are. So, if the baseball is a substance, the whiteness of the baseball is one of its properties, and the roundness of the baseball is another one of its properties. So when we talk about substance versus property dualism here, The question is whether there's this one thing, my body, and then another thing, my mind or my soul, and the two things kind of lead their separate but parallel lives. That's what substance dualists say. And then property dualists say that there's this thing, me, and that thing is different ways. Just as the baseball is both round and white, I am both conscious and also have neurons doing such and so. So I have these physical properties and also mental or phenomenal or consciousness properties. And the property dualist just says, hey, the properties that go into being conscious are different from the properties that go into any kind of physical arrangement. And this, I think of it's a matter of logical entailment. So if you're a substance dualist, you're probably you have to be a property dualist. But if you're a property dualist, you don't have to be a substance dualist. So when I say, I have some arguments that defend property dualism, but I think of those as neutral about substance dualism. So I think substance dualism might be true or it might be false, but I think I have some arguments that establish property dualism.
Right. But property dualists, when arguing, substance dualists, when they argue substance, it almost excludes property dualism?
No. I think substance dualism entails property dualism. So if you're a substance dualist, you gotta also be a property dualist. Because if you're a substance dualist, you think there's these two kinds of things, and those two things. There's the physical things and the mental things. And physical things have physical properties, and then presumably mental things don't have physical properties, but they have these other kinds of properties that make them conscious. So then you got to be a property dualist because you think there are physical properties and there are mental properties, and never the twain shall meet. But there's also a way of being a property. You can be a property dualist without being a substance dualist. You could think there's just one thing, and it's both physical and mental. You just think that its physicality and its mentality are distinct, just as the baseball's whiteness and sphericality are distinct. And then reductivists, people who are monists people who are property monists. You don't say that. You say people who are identity theorists or type identity theorists or reductionists or something like that. Everyone uses their own terminology. It makes it all really confusing because no two philosophers talk in quite the same way.
Right.
But the salient question is whether being conscious just is being so and so neuronally structured, or having such and such a function, or having such and such a behavior, or having such and such an informational integration value. And the identity theorists and the reductionists say yes. So to be a reductionist about baseball would be to say, oh well, for a baseball to be white just is for it to be spherical. And obviously that's wrong there. We know it's wrong there because we know that some baseballs can be spherical but not white, and some baseballs can be white but not spherical. So we know those two properties can't go together. With consciousness, it's harder because there's a range of physical properties that in all the cases we've checked go along with consciousness. So the question is just whether that's kind of an accident or maybe a law of nature linking two distinct things, or in fact whether it's sort of evidence that they're the same thing looked at from a different angle.
Right. Okay. So, in your view of dualism, in the property dualism, mind, body, what is there a point at which they are tied together? What are your views of how the two are joined together, or are they not joined? I know we're going to talk more about consciousness, the immortality of it and the survival of it, and maybe even the moment that it crosses over from existing to not existing. But, in your view of the dualism, what binding is there between consciousness and body?
Well, I don't have a worked out view on that. I haven't published explicitly on that topic. I tend to suspect that it seems to me that the most conservative thing to say, sort of theoretically conservative, is to say, well, so I think I'm a property dualist. I think that consciousness properties, phenomenal properties, as they're sometimes called, I think they're distinct from neuronal functional properties and so on. But I certainly think that the conservative thing to say is that there's some kind of laws linking the two. I think there's some kind of psychophysical laws I think they should probably be thought of along the lines of other laws of physics, laws that explain how the fundamental forces bind different kinds of things together. Here's how, different kinds of particles interact. Likewise, yeah, exactly. Here's how quarks and leptons get together. Here's how consciousness and matter gets together. And so I think as a general methodological point of view, I think it makes sense to expect that there will be such laws, as opposed to there just being these kind of funky anomalous correlations that can't be put into the form of a law. But I don't have a really strong view about what form those laws will take. And here there are a lot of options on the table for pretty much any theory of consciousness. There's a property dualist version of that theory where, so some people think consciousness just is a certain kind of behavior. To be in pain is to act like you're in pain. So in principle, you could have a theory where you say consciousness is distinct from being in pain. However, precisely those things are in pain, which act like they're in pain. That's just like a law of nature linking consciousness properties directly to behavior. That's pretty implausible, but you could do that. You could likewise, take your favorite theory at the neuronal level. You might think that consciousness is a property of oscillation around 40 hertz, and whenever the brain is sympathetically harmonizing with itself at that range, then if you're an identity theorist, that's what consciousness is. If you're a property dualist, you can say it's precisely under those circumstances that the patient subject is also conscious, and so on. So I don't have a strong take on that. There are these notoriously thorny questions about methodology there. I mean, I also wouldn't rule out these sort of Russellian monist approaches, which you may have heard something about from some of your other interviewees, where the idea is that there's some kind of proto-consciousness that's attached somehow to at the very fundamental level of reality. So there's some kind of proto-consciousness associated with each matter field, and somehow human complex consciousness arises out of the interactions. Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't. Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense. That is interesting.
I just think there's a lot we don't know there. I think all the work on these different theories is super interesting, and it's super interesting to see all the different kind of structural patterns people can find that seem to correlate to consciousness. But I just think, there are significant methodological hurdles in the way of anyone establishing any theory like that with any degree of certainty, because the trouble is, the only real way you can test it is on your own case. You can't really rely on what everyone else says, because for all you know, their consciousness isn't quite lined up the same way yours is. I mean, that's one of the questions on the table. So even if you assume that everyone else is aligned just exactly the way you are, there are still notoriously like all these different commonalities. I mean, it's very hard to decide whether consciousness is, say, a physical property having to do with the way your neurons are configured, or like a functional property that's going to be common to all creatures that sort of structurally are like you. Take some alien who's made out of different stuff than you, like a Martian pretend who's made out of silicon, or a robot who's made out of chips, and say that robot's chips perfectly simulate your neurons. Even if you found the neuronal property that you're pretty sure correlates with consciousness, is the robot conscious? Well, what experiment could you possibly do to figure that out? We can assume by hypothesis the robot will behave just like you. The robot mimics the robot's chip function mimics your brain function, but it's still not obvious how to tell whether the robot's conscious. We can make sense of either hypothesis. So I think all these questions are sort of, fun.
You have to ask the robot.
Well, the robot will say it's conscious, because we're assuming the robot.
But you don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, it's easy to say you're conscious. Well, I could program a chatbot right now that'll tell you it's conscious, but it's probably not.
Yeah, you have to eventually wait for it to say, "I think, therefore I am."
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So
on your dissertation, you talk about borderline consciousness.
Yeah.
And, so what does that mean? What is borderline consciousness? And what, do you have kind of a position that you're sitting on right now regarding it?
Yeah, so that's my main argument for property dualism. And, there are people like David Chalmers out there who have other arguments for property dualism, but in my dissertation, I give a new one. And the idea is, so borderlineness is the same as vagueness. So when, there's some things like event horizon of a black hole where there's an exact, line or surface in space-time, which is the exact point beyond which light cannot pass. No question about it. For any
singularity
point of space-time, it can be exactly calculated, right? But most things in our world are not like that. Most things are fuzzy and vague. So take being tall. Some people are tall. Other people are not tall. But there are some people on the cusp between being tall and being not tall, people for whom it doesn't seem right to assert that they're tall, but it also doesn't seem right to assert that they're not tall.
Right.
And so my dissertation is about that, whether or not there can be cases of consciousness like that, so whether there can be beings such that it's not right to say that they're conscious, but it's also not right to say that they're not conscious, not just because we don't know, but because they're in that nether region in between where it's neither true nor false.
Like you mentioned, I think an octopus.
Yeah, that's a good example. A lot of people have argued that, octopuses behave in some ways like conscious beings, in other ways not. They're functionally organized in some ways like conscious beings, in other ways not. So a lot of people like Peter Godfrey Smith, who's got a book on octopuses, argue that actually octopuses are borderline cases of consciousness. I argue that that's not right. I argue that in principle, the concept, like I was saying at the beginning, there's something special about the concept of consciousness. It's a primitive. It's not a concept that we define up out of lots of other simpler concepts. It's kind of a building block in and of itself. And the real gist of my argument in my dissertation is that there aren't really borderline cases of building block concepts. Building block concepts have to either apply or not apply. And that's a very general way of putting it. What I actually argue is that there are special features about the conceptual role of vague concepts. So when a concept is vague, like tall, and when you've got a case, a borderline case, a case where it's vague whether it's tall, there's something else you can say about that case. There's a way you can characterize that case positively that puts anyone who knows English, who knows the relevant language, that puts such a person into a position to say that it's a vague or borderline case. So that's to say, like, I could line up a row of people for you of increasing heights, and I could point to some people in the middle and say, those people, tell me about whether those people are tall. And you'd be in a position to say, oh, those people, it's not really right to say tall, not really right to say not tall. You'd be able to recognize that those people were borderline cases because of some description we could give of those cases. In this case, a pictorial description. But in the usual case, words suffice too. In the usual case, I could just say, hey, imagine someone who's a 5'11" European male. That's usually enough to get people to say, 5'11" for a European male, that's not really tall, but it's not really not tall. And if that doesn't work for you, we can tweak the example. It's all very contextually sensitive, of course, so it's hard. You have to tweak the examples, but you can usually come up with examples that work once you fix the context in the right sort of way. So another example is bald, right? There's a certain number of hairs on your head, and if you've got more hairs than that, you're pretty clearly not bald. If you have no hairs on your head, you're pretty clearly bald. But there's some intermediate setup where you've got a few hairs left, but not all that many, and pluck a few hairs more, add a few hairs more, and you could sort of say, it's a borderline case. I'm not sure whether I'd call that bald or not. So the main point for me is when you're dealing with a predicate that's vague or a concept that's vague, there's this thing that always happens, which is you can describe the features of borderline cases that explain why they're borderline. And moreover, that sort of put people in the position to know, that show people that these cases are borderline. And the thing with consciousness is that because the concept of consciousness is so isolated, it's really a primitive in its own right. there aren't enough descriptions that do that, because with consciousness, and this is sort of a part of the famous point of David Chalmers' work and some other people's work as well, arguably also Descartes, is that you can conceive, you can hold all the physical facts constant. You can conceive of a world where the mental stuff is different, even while you're imagining all the physical stuff is the same. So, for example, you can conceive of a world where everyone you know is a zombie, in the sense that they're not phenomenally conscious, even though they behave just like you. And that's to say that you can know all the physical facts, but still not know the consciousness facts. And so to here, the idea is even that, take that description of the octopus. Suppose we have the, Peter Godfrey Smith's book, and we read everything in it, everything he tells us about octopuses. And, he says, well, they've got these tentacles, and each tentacle kind of behaves autonomously, and there's a central unit, and the central unit does some amount of coordinating what the tentacles do, but not a lot. And, you hear all the details. And what are these details?
Right.
These are going to be details of the physical, functional, and behavioral characteristics of octopuses. And all these are going to be super interesting things to learn about, but none of them are going to, put you in a position to see that the octopus is neither conscious or not. You can make sense of lots of different hypotheses. You can still think, that's pretty weird, but maybe it is conscious. You can think, maybe each tentacle is conscious, and there's also a central brain which is conscious. So maybe for each octopus, there are 9 conscious beings. Or you can think, well, maybe the tentacles are conscious, but there's no central conscious being, so there's exactly 8 conscious beings for every octopus. Or you can think maybe there are 0 conscious beings. Maybe the octopus is actually just a zombie that behaves kind of like a conscious being. These are all things that you can still coherently entertain, even after you've been given all the physical facts about the octopus. In contrast, I'm arguing, you can't coherently entertain the possibility that a 5'11" European male is fully bald, is tall, or is not tall. Once you've been given the description 5'11" European male, and maybe fix whatever other contextual details, then it's kind of locked in that you're dealing with a borderline case of tall. So that's the important distinction for me. I think for those reasons, consciousness is a special exception, and there cannot be any borderline cases of consciousness. There can certainly be cases where we don't know.
What's the significance of that?
Well, I think with a few extra side assumptions, you can get from there to the conclusion that the contour between consciousness and the world and other things has to be really sharp. That is, it can't just. So one way of putting it, here's why. Let me tell you this. The reason it puts pressure on reductivist accounts is because most reductivist accounts depend on consciousness being vague. So, for example, the one I sketched earlier, which said consciousness is a matter of oscillation around 40 hertz. Well, that's a hopelessly vague theory. I'm being extra vague in the way I formulate it. One can be more precise than that. But the point is that, okay, what about 39.999 hertz? What about 39.9998 hertz? There can't be any infinitesimally fine line. And of course, when we talk about oscillation, we're talking about average rates over time. So what's the time been? How exactly are we taking these averages? And, there are all manners in which the exact precision, it would be an embarrassment for such a theory if it had to specify an exact time bin down to the Planck length, and then an exact cutoff for the average down to, infinitesimally fine measure. So I think that rules out reductive theories that are couched in vague terms. Such a theory could be almost true. Such a theory could be approximately correct for all I've argued so far, but it can't be exactly correct. And then you ask what's exactly correct. There, I think some other considerations come into play. I think another thing on the table is that we think of consciousness as a kind of joint in nature, a natural kind, in the sense that, well, there's a pretty real difference between things that are conscious and things that aren't conscious. So kind of like the way there's a pretty real difference between liquids and gases, or between ice and water or something like that. There's a real difference, and that difference means that you can't get, there has to be some kind of buffer zone in quality space. There has to be more than an absolutely fine transition to get from the one state to the other. It takes some work to get from one thing to the other thing. And that's where I think the real case for dualism comes in. So really it's a two-step argument. First, ordinary standing theories can't be quite right. Then when you look at the theories that could be quite right, if they were reductive theories, theories that identify consciousness with something physical, they'd have to be identifying consciousness with something pretty arbitrary. If it turns out that being conscious is a matter of having, brain oscillations at 3.8962413012496 ... Or above, then, you're really saying that like one Planck length less of energy in the relevant firing pattern, and the thing would no longer have been conscious.
No more conscious.
That suggests that the difference between consciousness and unconsciousness is like totally inconsequential. And so I think if you think that the difference is consequential, you have to reject such theories.
Yeah. Okay. So the significance really is in helping further the discussions and understanding of consciousness.
Yeah, I think it plays a role. I think we have to, and see, for me, I take there to be a kind of starting point there. I don't think I've argued for the significance of consciousness. I think that's just another premise.
Yeah.
But for me, it's no more wild of a premise than the premise that there's something, that the difference between ice and water is significant, or the difference between, these things it's things that can, of course, there's a kind of path from one to the other. You can change one into the other. You can get from one to the other by making small changes. It's just that there's got to be some kind of buffer zone in between. There's got to be more than one teeny tiny inconsequential step to get you from one to the other.
Right. Okay.
And I think, it's interesting. I mean, I think that there are a lot of arguments in this space which begin with some kind of first personal premise, some kind of premise about the importance of consciousness. And those premises are hard to justify you can't justify a premise like that by appealing to science. But what I think you can do is sort of point out how essential premises like that are to the way we ordinarily go through life. So one thing I've been thinking about recently is how much of a role consciousness plays in our thinking about values and morality. So a lot of the time when we think about why things are bad, they're bad because they cause people pain and suffering, right? But it's not. We don't care about the sort of neuronal adjustments that cause people to exhibit pain behavior. That's not what we care about. It's the experience of pain that's bad. And why do we think that's bad? And likewise, some states like joy or elation or pride or courage or are things that we think are intrinsically good or intrinsically to be praised or to be celebrated. And again, it seems to be that if you take away the consciousness, those are just sort of random particles bumping into one another, and it's hard to justify the normative import we attach. So it seems that it's the consciousness, the phenomenal consciousness, that gives these things their value. And that's one of the reasons I think consciousness is significant, because morality is impossible otherwise, if you ask me.
Yeah, that makes good sense. So taking that into, the next, I think, big concept that I saw you mentioning, especially in your paper on is immortality. And you go through the argument, I think, between analyzing Mendelssohn and Kant, and that gap between consciousness existing and then not existing. Can you give us kind of a quick summary of that argument, or what it is you looked at there in terms of immortality of consciousness, and that went before and after, or that moment in time? Does this relate to that? Sure. Like you mentioned about
So I mean, I was struck. What happened here was I was chatting with a friend who's a Kant scholar, and he asked me. He has this passage of Mendelssohn. There's little moment in the first critique where Kant spends a page or two addressing this argument that Moses Mendelssohn gives for the immortality of the soul. And, Kant comes along and he has some clever little thing that he says and he dismisses it. And, the funny thing, and for me, the sad thing is that sort of since that time, since Kant's two-page treatment of Mendelssohn's argument, pretty much the only attention this argument's had in the history of philosophy is people talking about Kant's dismissal of it. Kant took himself to have refuted it. And it's funny because at the time, so I looked into it, I hadn't seen the passage before. I don't really do much history of philosophy, but I was sort of intrigued and I looked into it and I was really surprised and impressed with what I found from Mendelssohn. At the time, first of all, Mendelssohn was like, a major intellectual celebrity of his day. Even later on, he went on to be sort of the father of the Jewish Enlightenment, and he was always sort of a figure of importance because he was sort of known to be Jewish, but still involved in the major philosophical works of the day. So, his friend Lessing, the playwright, wrote a play called Nathan the Wise, which actually was about Mendelssohn and sort of, the good Jew, that sort of thing.
Right.
But anyway, so he was an interesting character, but he had this book called the Phaidon, which was basically a reworking of Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, the one where he drinks, one about Socrates drinking the hemlock and killing himself. So he reworks this and he adds to it, and he develops this new argument for the immortality of the soul, and it was like a sensational blockbuster hit at the time. And Mendelssohn was famous because of this blockbuster, new argument for the immortality of the soul. And I thought it was kind of fascinating. And he was a cool guy. He ran a schmata factory. He ran a silk factory during the day and just sort of, scribbled in the evenings and managed to produce this thing. And later on managed to produce a whole realm of other impressive, works on Jewish philosophy and theology. And then he managed to win full civil rights for Jews in Germany and Austria. So, he was a pretty cool guy. But anyway, to the argument. The argument's interesting. And the real thing that moved me was the fact that the argument is cool, but no one is really talking about it anymore. And it actually is an argument that ties in with a lot of other arguments people make today in analytic philosophical metaphysics. So here's the argument. The argument that Mendelssohn gives is basically that the soul can't die because it would have to be, it's either going to be vague. If the soul dies, then it has to go from existing to non-existing. There has to be an earlier time at which it exists and a later time at which it no longer exists. So then he reasons, it's going to have to either be, vague or precise. There's either going to be a certain specific precise moment at which the soul goes out of being, or it's going to sort of be a gradual process. And Mendelssohn reasons for reasons that I sympathize with. He says, it can't be a gradual process. Basically, this is me putting words into Mendelssohn's mouth, because consciousness can't be vague. So it's either there or it's not at any given point in time. So it's going to have to be precise. But the trouble is, how could there non-arbitrarily be an exact moment at which the soul goes out of being? Basically, it's an argument from arbitrariness. It would have to be completely arbitrary which moment consciousness went out of being, and therefore we should favor theories that minimize the amount of arbitrariness. So we should favor theories in which basically there's a conservation of consciousness. And his argument's a little more refined. He's not just concerned with it being arbitrary which moments. In my view, he's concerned with a more special matter, which is whether or not, supposedly grant the time, say it's exactly noon on Thursday when a given soul goes out of being, but there's still a question. And the question is the time exactly noon? Is that the last moment at which the soul exists or the first moment at which the soul doesn't exist? And what Mendelssohn really thinks is that even if we can somehow settle that the time is noon on Thursday, we're still never going to be able to settle whether noon on Thursday is the last moment of existence or the first moment of non-existence. And he thinks that arbitrariness is really bad. And
therefore means that it doesn't die.
And therefore means it's sort of a matter of theoretical virtue. So, theory A that says there is such death is committed to all these arbitrary things happening that it can't explain in any clear way. And then a theory which says the immortality theory is not committed to that arbitrariness. So the immortality theory is to be preferred. It's not a knockdown argument because, of course, immortality theory will have other flaws. But the idea is that on this point, it's a feather in the cap of immortality theory and a black eye for mortality theory.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry. You were about to say your view, your opinion.
Oh, I mean, I think that. So I think there's a tendency when you look at arguments like that to say, well, now we have physics and we know that stuff can just be arbitrary. But I actually don't think it's that obvious because, there are interpretations of quantum mechanics where, certain events happen. There's some kind of objective probability and the wave function collapses, and whether, the quantum coin lands spin up or spin down is a matter of chance. So, maybe you could say something about that here. Maybe you could just say, well, it's like a special quantum event and it's a special matter of quantum chance whether, the soul, whether noon is the last moment of existence or the first moment of non-existence. But that's certainly not going to flow out of any quantum formalism we've got. So you're going to have to cook up a whole new theory of, the Schrödinger equation for souls, and you're going to have to tell a story about what collapses the soul wave function, and it's probably going to get pretty messy. So, even taking into account the ways that, quantum mechanics incorporate what looks like chance, it's not obvious that you can assimilate this kind of arbitrariness. Maybe if you sort of assimilate this case with the case of sort of virtual creation and annihilation of particles, you could maybe make something sound more plausible, but it's just not obvious how the two cases compare. So, again, I think this is all more compelling if we've already conceded something like property dualism. So if we already conceded that there's some, special sort of phenomenal quality and maybe even a phenomenal substance, then presumably that substance isn't going to be governed by the laws that govern microphysical particles. So you're going to have to cook up some new theory either way. And it's just not obvious how that new theory will be, it seems like the arbitrariness is going to be a problem for that theory, all the same.
Yeah. So what, I guess practically thinking, and I'm going to assume that we're talking about, the soul, that we're talking about consciousness. Are those two things one and the same in these arguments?
That's a good question. And there's certainly traditions that differentiate, but I'm being sloppy here and taking them to be the same. I was sort of thinking of first of all, I was thinking you could run this even just talking about like properties. So maybe, one possibility is that there's a kind of steady stream of things that instantiate phenomenal properties. And, it's not really me from, some people think that just as you can't step in the same river twice, me on Monday and me on Friday are different people.
Right.
So if you think that sort of thing, then it's sort of a different substance at every instant that's instantiating the phenomenal properties. The immortality argument would still have something to say. It might imply that, well, there's got to be something that goes on sort of have the phenomenal properties that kind of developed out of my current ones. But it might not. It might be a different thing, but that doesn't necessarily imply there's a soul. I think you could kind of get creative with the details there and go a lot of different ways. But intuitively, let's just say the soul is the thing that's conscious, and the claim here is that there's a thing that's conscious that continues your consciousness, and it would continue to exist after your physical death, presumably.
And so how would that look? Do you have any concepts? I think if I think back to the earlier part of our conversation, about mind, body, and any binding between the two, it's wasn't really a defined thing, and there could be these forces at play. I think it almost comes back into this instance. What actually survives, and where does it go?
Question.
And,
this is the downside to the theory. I think if you're motivated by, as I am, this sort of general sense that there have to be psychophysical laws, and we're entitled to think of them as sort of compact and elegant as possible. Or anyway, we're entitled to sort of look for law. We should favor theories that say that those laws are elegant, give us elegant accounts. Then it's hard to see how these kind of post-death souls are going to be doing much by way of experiencing without bodies, because it certainly looks as though the body mediates experience. Mendelssohn has a whole theory. On Mendelssohn's theory, basically, you just think. Souls post-death just sort of reflect on the abstract, because that doesn't require mediation of a body. But of course, even that, actual thought requires the brain to compute. So it's unclear whether even that's possible without a medium of computation. The most theoretically conservative theory of this would actually be a pretty pessimistic one. It would predict that you don't do much at all after you lose the body. Although maybe one could hold out hope. Maybe some kind of reincarnation would make up for that. Maybe as long as the soul kind of interacts later with another body, then it could get back some consciousness. I don't know. I should say, for me, this is an important argument and it's worth considering. But I think that there are some things to be said against. One thing to say in criticism is that if I'm right that consciousness isn't vague, there are already going to be some other kinds of arbitrariness in the ballpark, because the laws that couple phenomenal properties, consciousness properties, with physical properties are probably going to end up being kind of arbitrary in character, even at a time, because as I was saying before, it seems as though it can't be that the difference between being conscious and not being conscious just is the difference between oscillation at 8.2751 or oscillation anywhere above that. However, assuming that the laws are precise, they're going to have to say that, well, it just turns out that in this world, consciousness goes along with oscillation at precisely these frequencies and none lower. And that's going to be sort of arbitrary anyway. So if there can be those arbitrarinesses, in delineations at a time, maybe it's going to be of a piece, of a muchness, to impose kinds of cutoffs in across time as well. And if that's right, then the kind of theory you'd end up with wouldn't be too troubled by just allowing that it's kind of arbitrary when exactly the soul goes out of being. So I was thinking there are problems for physicalists in saying how there could be a perfect arbitrariness there. But I think once you've already got a psychophysical theory that has to incorporate some arbitrariness, maybe it won't be too hard to just allow arbitrariness in the temporal direction as well.
Right. Okay. Interesting. In looking at all of this, and I don't even know if you think about this part of it. I know it's one of my focuses, and one of the reasons I talk to so many smart people like you on the subject is trying to figure out if there's a way for us as humans to even expand or exercise or observe, interact with our consciousness, in any way. With everything you've studied and looked at, is that something you would even think about or have ever thought about or have any thoughts on, as far as how an individual can actually kind of, some people think about meditation. And when you go into a deep state of meditation, you seem to, your thoughts fall away and you're in kind of a moment where you seem to be almost with your own consciousness. Is there anything here that has a sort of a practical value of exercising or playing with or manipulating, molding one's consciousness? Is that something you've ever considered?
Well, I think that I tend to think that that's easier than it may sound. I think that actually anyone who's listening to this podcast has been engaged with a certain amount of that. Just the activity of trying to think about what consciousness is and what we're talking about when we talk about consciousness as opposed to the physical or functional trappings of consciousness. That's already, engaging in that activity. And, I'm always impressed. I find it very helpful to look at the empirical work sort of talking about disorders of consciousness, because sometimes, when you learn about all the different ways that it's sort of like, you don't know what you have until you've lost it. Similarly, reading about people who can like process all the features of a scene, but can't appreciate how they all hang together, or people who, can see the left side of their visual field, but not the right side of their visual field, or people who have experiences of their body parts not belonging to them, or people who have experiences of thoughts that aren't theirs, or people who have experiences of pain that they don't mind. All these kinds of things, when you read about, the evidence that there are ways of feeling like that, I think that just sort of helps me see, it's like, I guess there are these two components. Like take the pain example. I'm sort of fascinated by the phenomenon called asymbolia, and asymbolics say that they can feel pain, they just don't mind it. And this is different from, there's another phenomenon called congenital insensitivity to pain. And those guys just don't feel pain. They just don't feel it. They maybe feel it's not that they can't feel anything. They can feel bumps and stuff, but they don't feel the painful, they don't feel anything painy about it. So, they can just sort of burn themselves and not notice. And they tend to be very short-lived, unfortunately. But asymbolics, it's a more subtle thing. Asymbolics can actually feel the pain. They can tell the difference between the pain feeling and the kind of physical sensation associated with it. It's just that they don't mind that pain feeling.
Right.
So what it suggests is that there's this distinction between the feeling of pain and the feeling of minding the pain, or the feeling of wanting the pain to stop. And you might have thought those two were the same, but they have to be different. And
interesting. Okay. Yeah, that makes good sense. That's interesting. I've never even heard of those.
Yeah, and I think that there's obviously lots of other approaches like meditation and thinking, but for me, a lot of the times it's about a lot of the things that are most important in kind of expanding my consciousness of my consciousness is just sort of appreciating all the different features it has. Sometimes you need to resort to the third person. Sometimes just direct introspection isn't enough, and to really get at what's sort of marvelous and strange about consciousness, it helps to look at the evidence of how other people are feeling.
Yeah, that's interesting. Point. Yeah, it's kind of like looking at the whole mind, and when they finally separated the two sides of the brains and the behaviors they noticed at that point, it shed such a giant light.
Yeah.
On that, it's interesting. So, two more questions to get us wrapped up. The first one is, what else do you think you're going to be working on in the future? When it comes to consciousness, what else are you studying, or what are you getting excited about in the field? What breakthroughs do you see coming through here, and then what are you going to be involved in, and kind of what's exciting you about the future of the study of consciousness?
Well, I'm pretty excited or interested anyway in AI these days, and I think there's a lot of interesting questions about whether the machines are going to be conscious, whether if we upload ourselves digitally into the machines, whether we will remain conscious. I think those questions are going to be increasingly important, just as those technologies become real and more present in our everyday lives.
Yeah.
I think it's going to matter to more and more people. More and more people are going to find themselves confronted. All the sci-fi already explains why, I think, but are we mistreating our robot slaves? What do we owe to the robots? What do they owe to us? And then, for me, the particular interest I have in these questions has to do with vagueness, because I think that it's tempting for a lot of people sort of gravitate towards the answer that, well, it's a vague case, borderline case. And for me, because I have these arguments that it can't be a borderline case, the answer is inevitably harder than that. They're either conscious or they're not. We just don't know. And so we have to struggle a little more to figure out the way forward. I think I'm also interested in animal consciousness and, consciousness of the comatose and the people in, minimally conscious states, as they're called, or vegetative states, for similar reasons. I think that, there's a temptation to think, well, it's vague whether certain animals like lobsters or octopuses are conscious, and that maybe means we can kind of treat them like halfway between moral beings and beings that don't matter morally. And again, I think that can't be the right answer. Maybe they are conscious, maybe they're not. We don't know for sure, but it's bound to be one or the other, and that I think constrains how we think about it. So I'm sort of trying to bring this insight to bear on a lot of different cases of increasing relevance to our lives.
Yeah. And it's obviously important, especially when you look at define morality being tied to consciousness and how a conscious being feels as a result of the being treated by other conscious beings, so you're looking at the morality of somebody in a coma or an animal or even a robot. Yeah. I think that's
that's right. And I think it's also important, I want to get clearer in future work on which parts of consciousness are the parts that matter, morally. So, you might think one view says that it's just the mere fact of consciousness is intrinsically important, even if you're not really doing anything with it. Another view says it really matters. Pain is sort of negatively important, and maybe joy is positively important, but just the sensation of just sitting there and watching the paint dry, maybe that's not intrinsically important. So it's a question. You might think, well, it's just sort of the capacity to feel states that are important. Is that capacity itself important? I'm not sure. I've been meaning to work through my hunches on that one. But it might matter to some of these issues.
Cool. And my last thing is just an open-ended question. Is there anything else that you would want to, that you hoped that I would ask or you wanted to discuss before we wrap up?
Nothing comes to mind offhand. I thought that was a nice chat.
Good. Good. Me too.
But you know where to find me if you think of anything.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And John, I want to thank you again for your time today and joining the Consciousness Podcast. I really enjoyed talking to you, and you've left me with a lot to think about.
All right. It's been a real pleasure, Stuart. Thanks for having me on.
That concludes another edition of the Consciousness Podcast. Thanks again for listening. Please find us at Facebook at facebook.com/The Consciousness Podcast, at our Twitter handle at Conchcast, and don't forget to subscribe to our feed at theconsciousnesspodcast.com. Thank you for listening.